Hello everyone, I am David from Next Generation Automation. In today's class I will discuss the TestNG framework and its important components, annotations and attributes. TestNG is a next-generation open-source test automation framework for Java and very helpful for web, mobile, and API test automation projects. So let's get started. TestNG is a testing framework designed to simplify a broad range of testing needs, from unit testing, testing a class in isolation of the others, to integration testing, testing entire systems made of several classes, several packages and even several external frameworks, such as application servers. Writing a test is typically a three-step process. This includes, Step 1, write the business logic of your test, and insert TestNG annotations in your code along with TestNG attributes and their values. Step 2, add the information about your test, example class name, the groups you wish to run, in a testng.xml file, or in build.xml. Step 3, run TestNG from Maven or CI/CD DevOps pipeline. Now I will explain about TestNG block diagram. As shown in block diagram, TestNG framework plays an important role during test automation. TestNG framework integrates closely with test automation framework components like Selenium bases test scripts, logs generation, test reports generation and running test scripts based on test keywords or test data. Any test request first comes to TestNG framework and framework decides which test to run first and what should be set criteria while running any test. Now let's have a look at TestNG design. TestNG framework holds two important components, annotations and attributes. Annotations tag and TestNG define different states of testing like before test, before suite, after suite and many others. Based on this defined test state, corresponding business logic to be written by test engineer, as per application under test. Also TestNG frameworks holds information about attributes variables. Attributes variables define any criteria that needs to be set while running the test. Common attributes includes always run, groups and many others. Now let's understand more about the TestNG annotations. At the rate before suite annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method will be run before all tests in suite of run. At the rate after suite annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method will be run after all tests in suite of run. At the rate before test annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method will be run before any test method belonging to the classes inside the test tag is run. At the rate after test annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method will be run after the test method belonging to the classes inside the test tag have run. At the rate before groups annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method is guaranteed to run shortly before the first test method that belongs to any of mentioned groups is invoked. Next set of TestNG annotations includes. At the rate after groups annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method is guaranteed to run shortly after the last test method that belongs to any of mentioned groups is invoked. At the rate before class annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method will be run before the first test method in the current class is invoked. At the rate after class annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method will be run after all the test methods in the current class have been run. At the rate before method annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method will be run before each test method. At the rate after method annotation, as part of this annotation, the annotated method will be run after each test method. Now let's understand about the TestNG attributes that can be used by TestNG annotations, before suite, before test after test, before groups, after groups, before class, after class, before method, after method. First TestNG attribute going to be always run, for before methods, if always run attribute set to true, this configuration method will be run regardless of what groups it belongs to. And for after methods, if always run attribute set to true, this configuration method will be run, even if one or more methods invoked previously failed or was skipped. Second TestNG attribute going to be depends on groups. As part of this attribute, it defines the list of group s test method depends on. Third TestNG attribute going to be depends on methods. As part of this attribute, it defines the list of methods test method depends on. Fourth TestNG attribute going to be enabled. As part of this attribute, it defines whether test class or method enabled. Fifth TestNG attribute going to be groups. As part of this attribute, it defines list of groups test class or method belongs to. Sixth TestNG attribute going to be inherit groups. As part of this attribute, if set as true, it defines test method belong to groups specified in the @test annotation at the class level. 7th test_ng attribute going to be only for groups. This attribute works only for @before method and @after method test_ng annotation. As part of this attribute, if specified, then this setup or teardown method will only be invoked if the corresponding test method belongs to one of the listed groups. Now I move to few other test_ng annotations. Next test_ng annotation that I am going to discuss about @data provider annotation. @data provider test_ng annotation marks a method as supplying data for a test method. The annotated method must return an object two-dimensional array where each object array can be assigned the parameter list of the test method. The @test method that wants to receive data from this data provider needs to use a data provider name equals to the name of @data provider annotation. Now let's have a look at data-driven tests developed as part of Learn enterprise-level automation program from Next Generation Automation. As shown, provide data method contains @data provider annotation with attribute name as data provider login. This data provider method going to set 3 data values: username, password and welcome message after login to Next Generation Automation website. And to use the data provider method, one more test method will be created a login data provider test. This method contain @test annotation along with data provider attribute. Data provider login. Also as shown input parameters of this method mapped with corresponding test data values returned from @data provider method. Now let's understand about the test_ng attribute that can be used by data provider test_ng annotation. Data provider annotation can be set with 2 attributes: name and parallel. Name attribute set the name of data provider. And if it's not supplied, the name of data provider will be automatically be set to the name of the method. Parallel attribute if set as true, let the test supported by this data provider to be run in parallel. By default value of attribute set as false. Other test_ng annotations that can be used are listeners, parameters, and test. Listeners test_ng annotation define listeners on a test class. Listener test_ng annotation contain attribute, value and it defines the array of classes that extend org.test_ng.i_test_ng listener. Parameters test_ng annotation describes how to pass parameters to @test method. Parameters test_ng annotation contain attribute, value and it defines the list of variables used to fill the parameters of test method. And last we have @test, test_ng annotation. Every test case contains @test, test_ng annotation. And this annotation marks a class or a method as part of the test. Now let's understand about the attributes used by @test, test_ng annotation. Always run attribute. As part of this attribute if set to true, test method will always be run, even if it depends on a method that failed. Data provider attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the name of the data provider for test method. Data provider class attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the class where to look for the data provider. If not specified, the data provider will be looked on the class of the current test method or one of its base classes. And if this attribute is specified, the data provider method needs to be static on the specified class. Next set of attributes used by @test, test_ng annotation are depends on groups attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the list of groups test method depends on methods attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the list of methods test method depends on. Description attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the description about test method. Enabled attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines whether methods on test class or method are enabled. Next set of attributes used by @test, test_ng annotation are expected conditions attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the list of exceptions that a test method is expected to throw. If no exception or a different than one on this list is thrown, this test will be marked a failure. Groups attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the list of groups test class or method belongs to. Invocation count attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the number of times test method should be invoked. Next set of attributes used by @test, test_ng annotation are invocation timeout attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the maximum number of milliseconds this test should take for the cumulated time of all the invocation counts. This attribute will be ignored if invocation count is not specified. Priority attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the priority for this test method. Test with lower priorities will be scheduled first. Success percentage attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the percentage of success expected from this method. Next set of attributes used by @test, testng annotation are single-threaded attribute. As part of this attribute if set to true, all the methods on this test class are guaranteed to run in the same thread, even if the tests are currently being run with parallel set as methods. This attribute can only be used at the class level, and it will be ignored if used at the method level. Timeout attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the maximum number of milliseconds this test should take. Thread pool size attribute. As part of this attribute, it defines the size of the thread pool for this method. The method will be invoked from multiple threads as specified by invocation count. With this, I have reached the end of today's class. In today's class, I have discussed in detail about testng framework, annotations, and attributes. In next class, I will switch to development environment and let QA engineers understand how to use testng annotations and attributes both at class level and method level. Thanks for watching.